I wanted to step, be the first on Mars, first on Venus, go out and actually touch and explore new worlds. But I graduated just a few months before the first moon landing, and it was pretty clear to me that beyond the moon program, there was nothing in terms of planetary exploration except for unmanned vehicles. I was hoping that we'd be looking at Mars by now. We're just starting to look at Mars 50 years later, so I'm glad I didn't invest a lot of time in a career in planetary exploration. It just never happened. So I ended up going into my family's soft drink business, which is something I had sworn I would never do because I had been raised in it since a kid. But I went and I enjoyed it. End of September of 2008, I got my clients completely out of stocks. And that worked out well because the next 2 months, the market just got beat to death. And I stayed out probably a little longer than I should have. And when you're going to manage risk, I don't call that market timing, I call that managing risk, okay? Where you just assess that market conditions are so antagonistic toward your portfolio, you ought to take some protective measures. You need an exit plan, but you also need a re-entry plan. And I didn't really have a good re-entry plan, so it took me a little bit longer to back in the market than I did. When I first did my first research, I got a lot of nasty mail, including one death threat, actually, over a 4% rule. You're going to threaten my family? Is it really worth that?
I have not heard that in our research, so maybe you hear it here first. Bill Bengen needed some security.
Yeah. It's imagine how people get ultra sensitive, but so you have grown some thick skin, and I'm sure we'll be able to see exactly what you think in this book.
Welcome to Catching Up to FI, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Jackie, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your host. We're here to help you on your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to FI together.
Welcome back to Catching Up to FI. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Jackie Cummins-Koski, and we're not too far out from having gone to the Bogleheads Conference. And one of the reasons I went was because of our guest today, Jackie. Didn't we have fun meeting Bill Bengen?
Oh my gosh, we had an amazing time, and what an honor. We had dinner with him and his lovely wife and got to spend so much time with them. So it's a real treat today, and our audience is going to love it too.
Yeah, so we can dive into the material. Let's do a quick introduction in case there's one person out there that doesn't know who Mr. Bill Bengen is. So our guest today is Bill Bengen, one of the most influential figures in the financial planning industry, and is best known as the inventor of the famous or infamous 4% rule of thumb, which we'll talk about, wasn't exactly his intent. This rule suggests that retirees can withdraw 4% of their savings annually adjusted for inflation to make their savings last for 30 years. Mr. Bengen's research and publications have made significant contributions to the field of retirement planning, helping countless individuals and financial professionals better understand how to manage retirement funds effectively, especially in the accumulation phase and not just decumulation. Bill's groundbreaking work was published in October 1994. So guess what? This is the 30-year anniversary of this article. It's hard to believe it's been that many years, and he's retired now, so we'll hear about that. He built his original findings from extensive historical market data to determine a safe withdrawal rate. Beyond his research, Bill has been an active voice in the financial community, frequently speaking at industry conferences and contributing to leading financial publications. His insights continue to shape the strategies of the FI community, retirees, and financial professionals. He's currently working on his next book, which will probably be out in the first quarter, second quarter of next year, and is geared towards consumers rather than financial professionals and filled with a bunch of new ideas on how we should spend more in retirement. So Bill Bengen, welcome to Catching Up to FI.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and look forward to our talk.
Well, you weren't always a financial planner, right, Jackie?
Yeah, Bill, we've been digging a little bit. And what did you do before you got into financial planning and started doing all this research around the 4% rule?
Well, for a few years, I was a drug lord. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not Walter White.
He was a stand-up comedian.
Yeah, that's right. Breaking Bad right here.
You were trained at MIT and you wanted to be a rocket scientist, but it didn't really work out that way. Why is that?
That's the way life is, right? I'm really interested in planetary exploration. I want to do the whole Matt Damon thing on Mars. I want to be the first on Mars, first on Venus, go out and actually touch and explore new worlds. But I graduated just a few months before the first moon landing, and it was pretty clear to me that beyond the moon program, there was nothing in terms of planetary exploration except for unmanned vehicles. I was hoping that we'd be looking at Mars by now. We're just starting to look at Mars 50 years later, so I'm glad I didn't invest a lot of time in a career in planetary exploration. It just never happened. So I ended up going into my family's soft drink business, which is something I had sworn I would never do because I had been raised in it since a kid. But I went and I enjoyed it. I ended up running the business for a number of years. And then we sold that. Actually, in the 100th year that was in our family, we sold the business. And I moved out to California and looked at alternative careers and settled on finance advising. And somewhere along there, discovered something called the 4% rule.
Well, what's interesting too is you're a bit of a market timer too, and you timed the market really well when you sold the family business, right?
Yeah, it turned out that our primary brand, 7-Up, which at one time was one of the top 3 soft drinks in the United States, shortly after we sold it, lost great amount of market share. And if we had stayed in business, it would have destroyed us because that was our primary profit source. And if we'd lose that, it would not have been good. So yeah, that worked out well in retrospect. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
Yeah, we'll find out later. You know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And it's not all about buy and hold, but let's save that for a little bit of surprise later. Jackie, we need to hear a little bit about how Bill Bengen got into financial planning and why.
Yeah, Bill, that's an important question because the research that Bill Bengen did in regards to the 4% rule, not everybody was trying to solve problems back then, right? It was a system where it was heavily around investments and assets under management. That was the focus and things like that. However, I guess we should start by maybe you telling us what problem were you trying to solve as you were in this financial advisory industry? You could have sort of trotted along like everyone else. So how did you get started with it, and how did the 4% rule and your desire to want to solve that withdrawal rate question that everybody was asking?
Yeah, as far as the first part of it, how I got into financial advising, when I moved to California, I took 6 months off and just started considering at the age of 40 what the rest of my life would be built around, and looked at a number of alternative careers. And I knew that I had a quantity of money that I wanted to invest. I knew I had financial issues that everyone else faced. And I started reading about financial advising, particularly the new movement at that time, fee-only advising. And I became very enthused about the concept. And I said, I'm going to have somebody do this work, this financial planning for me. Why don't I develop the expertise so that I can do it for myself and for others as well? And that turned out to be a great decision because I think I enjoyed financial advising more than anything else I've done in my life. The interaction with clients, the fact that I could make a difference in people's lives every single day was very inspiring to me.
Well, interestingly, in your practice, you were one of the first flat fee or fee only financial advisors. And that came about because of a relationship you developed with NAPFA, right?
That's correct. And back in those days, the late 80s, there was a lot of doubt about whether advisors operating on a fee-only basis could run a viable practice. Believe it or not, there was a lot of criticism from people who felt it was not a viable way to manage it. Of course, that's all turned around now. It's established itself successfully. But yeah, NAPFA was an enormous help. And a lot of the people I met in my early days are still friends of mine. And it's great. Sure, I miss my clients, though.
Now, in case someone doesn't know what NAPFA stands for, do you remember what it stands for, Bill? So I've got 2 Bills here. If I say your last name, Bill Bengen, it's not because I'm trying to be formal. So what does NAPFA stand for?
National Association of Personal Financial Advisors.
Yeah. And basically, it is an organization for flat fee advisors. Is that correct?
Actually, fee-only advisors, no commissions. That's the distinction.
No commissions. And these days, commissions aren't as common as they used to be. Mainly commissions would be in the insurance industry.
Yeah, of course, the brokerage industry, there are practically no commissions anymore now for personal financial products, which is a wonderful improvement for the individual investor over 30 years ago. That's just fabulous.
When you got started as a solo practitioner, you didn't scale. I mean, I think I heard in the podcast you did with Michael Kitces that at a max, your practice was about 80 clients. So that's unique as well.
Yeah, I didn't want to develop a large practice. I just wanted to deal with a group of people who I've become very close with, and kind of like the old doctor, little black bag. If necessary, I go to their house, make a house call if I have to. You can't do that, obviously, if you have a very large practice, but I enjoyed it. It was a practice I could operate out of an office, which I built attached to my home in Southern California, and it really satisfied me on many levels: financial, emotional, philosophically. It was a very gratifying way to do business.
Yeah, you took care of a lot of your neighbors. And as Jackie mentioned before, you bumped up against a question that had not been answered in the CFP textbooks. What was the rule of thumb prior to your research that ended up with the safe withdrawal rate of 4%?
Yeah, when I started, clients were asking me about that. They were starting to look 20 years ahead. They were all baby boomers, as was I, and wondering about retirement and how much they should save. And when they get there, how much could they spend and how should their investments be set up to prepare themselves for retirement and operate during retirement. So at that point, when I started looking at it, I was a newly minted CFP, and I went first to my textbooks expecting to find answers, and I couldn't find a single article in all those textbooks about this subject. So the next thing, I went to the library, checked out financial publications, magazines. Of course, back then in the 90s, you didn't have the internet as a tool. Everything would have to be manual. I couldn't find anything in publications that was very specific. So I called some of my local fellow advisors in the San Diego area and asked them, and their answers were all over the map. And not surprisingly, because at that point, that issue had not become something that was top of mind. For many years, people had basically retired, and because of short life expectancies, maybe lived for 10 years. We're just living 10 years in retirement. You don't need to worry about spending rates. You can just have a jolly old time spending. I decided that there were no answers coming from anywhere, so I decided to find myself, and I just sat down with a computer and a book of data and started using my spreadsheet to explore this new realm. Here I am, 30 years later, still doing the same darn thing.
Now, that's a true engineer right there.
Yeah, that's right.
So I do have a question about the generation in which you were working with. You mentioned the baby boomers, and this was 30 years ago. So pensions were very prevalent back then. Was that a piece that you saw a lot, where that was another reason why the whole withdrawal rate thing just didn't come up that much? Because you've got that juicy pension that your clients may be getting every single month. Was that part of sort of softening the blow of even figuring this out?
Yeah, I think that was before the 401k movement gained a lot in the corporate world. Pensions and Social Security at that time were the mainstay of folks' retirement. Now, of course, things have changed considerably. Pensions are almost passé. So people have to rely more and more upon their own resources, their own saving to get where they want to be during retirement.
Yeah, what do you think about what we call the retirement savings crisis? Our audience is an audience of late starters, predominantly Gen X, some late boomers, and then between 35 and 55, 60. What do you think about today's retirement crisis because of the transition from that defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan?
Well, it's a lot tougher for folks today because they're going to have to rely on their own savings. Depending upon what kind of lifestyle they want to live, that's a decision you need to evaluate early on. There's no sense saving vast amount of money if you're going to live in a cardboard box somewhere. If you're going to have a very modest lifestyle, you don't have to do that. But if you want to have some freedom to spend discretionary, you're going to have to save significant amounts from your current income to get there. And even with 10, 15 years, you should be able to save a great deal of money given the compounding effect.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the message we try and get out to our late starters is it's really never too late as long as you can at least have a runway of 10 to 15 years and you can create financial stability and security even if you start later. It's never too late to start, and it gives you financial wellness to do so, even if you're going to depend more on something like Social Security ultimately or needing to work later.
I agree.
Yeah. So, Bill, you were diving into your spreadsheets and you said, you know what? Nobody has the answer to this question. My clients keeps asking me, and I want to figure this out. So your engineering mind, your aerospace mind goes to work and you start digging. So we know you didn't get it right the first time. I guess take us through kind of your thought process, what things didn't work, what finally gave you that aha moment that I think this is it, to lead you to actually publishing that research for all the world to see.
Sure. Well, I started with a very simple approach. I used just two asset classes, U.S. large company stocks and U.S. intermediate term government bonds, like 5-year bonds. No one would construct a portfolio from those assets, but I wanted to get a result quickly and simply. And basically, I took a database starting with 1926 and I reconstructed the investment experience of retirees, 1926 to date. And there's a lot more retirees to study 30 years later than there was back then, but there was enough information available for me to come to the conclusion that in the worst case, which turned out to be somebody retiring in the late 60s, with that mix of two assets, they could take out 4.15%. And I hate that 5 in there because it implies too great a degree of precision for this kind of research. There's a lot of uncertainty in it. But that was the number I came up with. And that was basically taking money out like Social Security, where you take out 4.15% the first year and then give yourself a COLA each year after that. And what happened, once that paper got published and got kind of into the popular realm, the 4.15% got shut into 4%. And then it became, from a particular unique situation applying to just one retiree out of hundreds, it became the 4% rule.
You were against rules of thumb, and your research ended up in the new rule of thumb, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, I had no control over that process, just the nature. I learned a lesson from that. But the phrase 4% rule at least gives everybody a frame of reference to what we're talking about. So I've stopped finding it so hard now. I've even put it on my license plate, Mr. 4%. I've given in.
There is the title of the show, Mr. 4%.
Read the book or see the movie, yeah.
I'm curious, too, you mentioned the two asset classes, but what was the asset allocation to those classes that gave you the rule?
Well, one of the most amazing results I achieved at the beginning, and I've learned in this research over many years that you never assume anything. You never know when you start putting the numbers together what's going to come out. I drew a chart where I varied the asset allocation, the amount of stocks in a portfolio, and matched that against the resulting withdrawal rate. And amazingly, between 40 and 70%, but kind of looked like Devil's Tower with that flat top. It didn't make any difference whether you held 40% stocks or 50 or 60 or 70%. You came out with the same withdrawal rate, 4.15%, which totally unexpected. I thought the thing would peak like Mount Everest, somewhere in the middle, and I didn't know exactly where. So there's room for conservative and aggressive investors, but they both get the same result. Important thing was not to fall off the edges of this mesa. If you get too light on stocks, when a big stock market decline comes, your portfolio gets too hard and it reduces the withdrawal rate. The same token, if you invest too much in bonds, they don't have enough oomph to get your portfolio the returns it needs, and therefore your withdrawal rate also suffers. So if you stayed in the middle ground, you were okay, and that still applies to my current research.
So do you think your 4% rule resulted in this dogma of the 60-40 portfolio too?
No, I think that came out of earlier research, some of the work Markowitz did on efficient market theory and so forth. I think that came from the 50s. My research may have just simply unintentionally offered some support and a buttress to that concept. That's possible, but I'm not going to take credit for a Nobel laureate's work. I'll tell you that much.
Maybe he should be put up for the Nobel Laureate Prize for economics. That's a good idea, Jackie. We'll have to nominate him.
I know at Bogleheads, they had that sheet to try to get Jack Bogle nominated for, oh gosh, what was the award?
The Congressional Medal of Honor or something like that.
Did he win that award? Because he certainly deserved.
We hope that he does. I sure signed it, and there was a lot of signatures.
He was a great man. He was a titan of our profession.
Yeah. Also, with regards to the development of the 4% rule, what variables you based sort of your individual client accumulation and withdrawal strategies on? What affects this rule? Because in reality, the dogma of the 4% is more of a variable rate around 4%, just like what you said between 40 and 70 allocation to stocks. It's really sort of a 3.5% to 5.5% slider rule.
Yeah, well, I've identified what I call 8 variables that you have to take into consideration before you can even hope to come up with a so-called number. Things like how long you're planning for. You're planning for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. Depending upon the length of time you plan for, you're going to come up with a different number. Are you taking primarily from a taxable account or a tax-deferred account or a tax-free account? That will affect the withdrawal rate. I can look at factors here. Are you planning to leave an inheritance to your heirs? Whereas the 4% rule, if I can use that term, assumes that after 30 years, with your dying breath, you will run out of money. I don't think anyone's timing is quite that good. But let's say you want to specifically leave a certain sum of money in your portfolio, your retirement portfolio for heirs. That will affect your withdrawal rate as well. Your asset allocation will too, although if you stay in the middle ground, that's not a major factor. Are you satisfied with index returns? Or are you going to try to emulate Warren Buffett or another great investor and try to shoot for higher returns, which will lead to higher withdrawal rates if you're successful. But if you're unsuccessful, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, pretty clear. So that and a few other factors like portfolio rebalancing, frequency, you have to answer each one of those before you could even hope to come up with any kind of withdrawal rate.
I think you also mentioned inflation as one of these big factors too, which today becomes potentially more of an issue. Can you describe how inflation can affect your safe withdrawal rate?
You bet. Once you've answered each of those 8 variables, and there are 2 more things you do have to consider. And for years, based on an article Michael Kitces wrote back in 2008, it was pretty clear that stock market valuation was important. I knew from my research that if you had a major bear market early in retirement, it was going to reduce your withdrawal rate significantly. And because basically the market's going down while you're taking increasing amounts of money out, it puts a lot of pressure in your portfolio, so reduce the withdrawal rate. But the connection between the two, although look very compelling, just weren't close enough to form a strong enough correlation to say, yeah, if your stock market is valued, let's say at PE of 20, then you should take out this withdrawal rate. And if it's a PE of 16, you should take that. And you just couldn't find a correlation. There was one factor missing. I was almost certain it was inflation, but for many years, I couldn't figure out how to work inflation into the equation until one day, about 3 summer goals, I was sitting there and I said, I think I'm making a mistake. I'm trying to put stock market valuation first and then figure what affects inflation. What if I put inflation as the most important determining factor first and then stock market valuation second? And the minute I did that, things just sorted themselves out beautifully. The correlation was much higher. So if you know both those factors, stock market valuation, let's say using the Shiller PE ratio, which is available on the internet, also can form a reasonable estimate of what inflation is going to be like over the next 5 years. I call that the inflation regime. You can come up with a withdrawal rate which pretty accurately reflects what's happened historically. I hate to use the word predict because who knows what will happen in the future. It could be different what's happened in the past. In terms of reproducing what's happened in the past, those 2 factors bring it pretty darn close.
Before we continue, let us pause and share some words about one of this week's sponsors, Delete Me. You ever wonder how much of your personal data is out there on the internet for anyone to see? More than you think.
Oh my gosh. Yes, Bill. I mean, your name, your contact information, social security number, and home address, even information about your family members. And it's all being compiled by data brokers and sold online. Oh, that's so scary. But data brokers make a profit off of your data. Your data is a commodity, and anyone on the web can buy your private details.
Yeah, Jackie, I had my ID stolen, and that's why I now use Delete Me. Delete Me is a subscription service that removes my personal information from hundreds of data brokers. With Delete Me, I get a regular personalized privacy report showing what info they found about me, where they found it, and what they removed.
Yeah, and Delete Me is not just a one-time service. They're always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. And to put it simply, Bill, Delete Me does all the hard work of wiping out you and your family's personal information from data brokers' website.
Yeah, Jackie, I am so grateful to this product because I now feel safer knowing that people aren't selling my information and they're not going to be able to impersonate me.
Yeah, what peace of mind, right?
All right, so take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners, go to joindeleteme.com/catching up. That's joindeleteme.com/catching up.
So, Bill, I have a question. For the allocation of the portfolio, did you include any international in there?
Yes, currently I have 7 asset classes, and one of them is international stocks. Absolutely. And they haven't been great performers lately, but it's the nature of asset allocation is that there are a period of times when some of your asset classes are going through the low point of their cycle and they look like duds. But it's proven mistake that if you try to be too cute with that, because you usually sell it at the wrong time, just when they're ready to take off. So I keep international stocks in my allocation as a permanent fixture.
Well, what were the other six? We'd like to talk about how do we boost this. And we have a lot of folks putting research out there that gets us to 5%. And I think that's going to be a tenet of your new book. Maybe take a step back. In the day that you were an advisor with your clients, you said you invested your money just like you invested your clients. What was that allocation? And were you an early adopter of the index funds in your portfolios?
Yeah, when I was in practice, I used index funds a lot. Occasionally, I would buy an individual stock if I felt really a compelling case for it. But for the most case, I was satisfied with getting market returns, international stocks, emerging markets, REITs, U.S. large cap, mid cap, small cap, micro cap, some commodities, now maybe even Bitcoin. That's when a small percentage makes sense to include in portfolio. Just building a world diversified portfolio. That's so well established. That's one of the, what I call the 4 free lunches that are available to investors, that it will increase your returns and your withdrawal rate, but does not increase your risk.
So when you were investing your clients' money like you did yours, you didn't stick to sort of the simple thing that you used for the 4% rule. You were using multiple asset classes even at that time?
Yes, that's right. Part of the reason why I haven't used so many now is because I had trouble initially finding databases that went back to 1926 that incorporated all those other asset classes. That's only the last 10, 12 years they've started to become available. But there's still asset classes like REITs and emerging markets and so forth, which don't have good long-term databases. So I haven't been able to work them into my research yet. I'm hoping the next round of research, in 2046, I'll have that.
Because we talk about early, mid-career, and late. What would you recommend for, say, an early saver as far as an asset allocation and a portfolio for accumulation?
Honestly, you don't see any reason to have anything other than 100% equities if you're looking at your 20s, your 30s, because your goal there is to accumulate capital as rapidly as possible. And stocks do that, particularly when you have such a long time frame. You don't have to worry about volatility, market fluctuations. It's only when you get nearer retirement where things get a little dicey. So I wouldn't be including any bonds. I'd be just hanging it out there in 100% stocks, get a well-diversified selection of global equities, and sit back and watch it compound.
So are you a fan of saying using one equity class, meaning the total world fund, where you have market cap across all industries and 8,000 to 9,000 companies? That would include international.
I don't see any reason not to do that approach, although I don't know if that approach includes any gold. I think you need to have precious metals and gold in your portfolio today. You may want to have a little Bitcoin in your portfolio today. I don't know if that approach would include REITs or alternative investments, which I honestly don't know that much about, but I know there are a lot of people very high on that concept.
So would you be a boglehead where you'd say VTSAX or VTI and chill for the 20s, 30s, and maybe even 40s investors?
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad strategy at all. I think it'll be rewarding over a very long period of time.
There you go. There's that keep it simple philosophy there. Jail Collins, Simple Path to Wealth. And I also wanted to point out, as you're talking about the year in which you were doing this research, there wasn't a lot of resources available. So you were doing one thing with your clients because you could use some of those unique things. But then during your research, there's not a lot of asset classes where you even had resources to go back as far as you wanted to go back. So I feel like this research in today's world with technology and everything easily accessible would have been a lot easier, but you were doing it at a time where things weren't as accessible. You didn't have a lot of resources. So you're doing a lot of extra work because you're just way before your time in digging into this. And you refer to it as a rule of thumb because there's so much that has changed since you've done the research. And I feel like we still talk about it like you did it yesterday. It's just so fascinating.
That's true. Sometimes I feel like 2 years after I published my first paper, they invented the wheel, which would have made it a lot easier. But the internet came along, computers made Monte Carlo simulation, which I don't use, but a lot of folks use to do this kind of analysis. It wasn't possible back then. So, yeah.
All right, so here's the pregnant question for us with our audience. You talk about all equities through what time period would you say? But what if you're starting at, say, 45 or 50 and you plan on a 10 to 15 year window towards retirement? This is what our audience wants to know. What would you do then with your asset allocation?
I still think if you're 45, you still want to be looking at a very, very heavy equity allocation. I think when you get within 5 years of retirement is a time when you start start looking to play a little safer. To a certain extent, it may depend upon your assessment of market valuations. I mean, if the stock market is valued like it is today and you're 45 and starting to save, I'd really have a lot of reservations about going 100% stocks. I'd be concerned about something happening in the next few years where I could lose a lot of money. But in general, if you're in a period of time where stocks are reasonably valued and there's no reason not to, I would be looking at 100% stocks up to within 5 years of retirement.
So my question today is, given valuations and the variables you talked about, is 70-30 kind of the new 60-40 for that reason?
Are you talking about people in retirement or for those accumulating?
Those accumulating.
I don't think 60-40 ever should be used for the accumulation phase until you get toward the very end of it. I think keeping it as pedal to the metal in stocks for as long as you can handle it is going to give you the greatest benefit in terms of what you accumulate for retirement.
So I have a question around, you listed out some of those items, those variables that you got to think about. I know that these are factors, but I think some people overlook them, especially today. It's the Social Security part, because that could obviously cover a chunk, right, of what you need to live on. And then if you have a pension, even if it's a frozen pension, a lot of our generation, if you're in your 40s and 50s, you might have experienced where you started at a job that had a pension and then it got frozen, so it might not be as big. And then these days you got side hustles and things like that. So I feel like sometimes we just sort of ignore that, but that makes a big difference, right?
Yeah, it really does. Some things you just cannot overlook.
Yeah, when you came up with the 4% rule, that was really for decumulation, for a safety factor. That was the worst case scenario. But the 4% rule gets used a lot for accumulation. Do you think in some ways it's better to have a fixed 4% rule for accumulation, 4% of your expenses, so that you can figure out really how much do I need? And then after you get to that, your FI number, then you sort of start looking at all the variables and asset allocation and for decumulation.
And this is talking about the decumulation stage?
The accumulation. Do you think it's in some ways using a fixed and more dogmatic 4% rule is a better rule for accumulation?
I don't think the 4% rule has a place in the accumulation stage. Once again, the goal of accumulation is to accumulate as much capital as possible, as rapidly as possible, while the goal in retirement is to maintain a nest egg as long as you can under the influence of withdrawals. Those withdrawals put a lot of stress on a portfolio. You don't have to worry about that during the accumulation stage. So I would just close your eyes, hold your nose, and put it all in stocks and let it happen.
So I think, Bill, are you sort of referencing the 25 times your expenses? Like, how do you know, in order to come up with a 4% rule, to know how much you need to accumulate, we divide 100 by 4 and that you get 25 times. So that's the number we use all the time in the FI community as far as how big does your nest egg need to be so that on the back end, you could take out 4%. So we do 25 times your expenses.
If you invert to 4%, that's how you get that. Exactly. That seems reasonable. And for folks who have really long time horizons, like the fire folks, 30, 40, 50 years, even though my current research says we're closer to 5% than 4%, when you look at a really long time horizon, you probably should be closer to 4, maybe low 4s. So the 25 rule probably makes sense.
So what's interesting to me, too, is in doing our research, we realized that you're not a complete fan of the dogma of buy and hold. Tell us your story about how you took your clients in and out of the market and did market timing. So I want to hear the story about how you really worked and how you knew that things are coming here and I need to protect my clients and protect their capital.
Yeah, I remember back in 2008, those who lived that bear market will never forget that. It was late in August of 2008, and the market had declined significantly already. But if you remember at that time, we were dealing with a banking crisis. We had Lehman Brothers and other things. And every day there just seemed to be worse and worse news coming out over the press about the health of the financial system. So at the end of September of 2008, I got my clients completely out of stocks. And that worked out well because the next 2 months, the market just got beat to death. And I stayed out probably a little longer than I should have. And when you're going to manage risk, I don't call that market timing. I call that managing risk, okay? Where you just assess that market conditions are so antagonistic toward your portfolio, you ought to take some protective measures. You need an exit plan, but you also need a reentry plan. And I didn't really have a good reentry plan, so it took me a little bit longer to back in the market than I did. Today, of course, I use a third-party subscription service that helps assess the risk in the market, and they recommend what percentage of your equity allocation you should maintain. If I had that tool back in 2009, I would have been back in the market in April and May and gotten almost all of that upswing. So you need both sides of the knife, so to speak. It's not enough to get out of the market. In the long run, you want to be in that stock market to get those returns. You have to be very careful not to be overcautious and cheat yourself, basically, of the returns that are available.
And what's interesting is you timed it also back in 2002. I mean, your client benefited twice from your ability. And what was the system you used to get out of it? How did you know things were bubble-esque and you needed to protect your clients?
I didn't have that third-party subscription service then. It was just my general knowledge of the markets and my feel of the markets, that there was so much speculation had gone on for such a long time and that so many abuses had built up that hadn't been paid for. And the bill always comes due. That's one thing that comes true in markets. The bill always comes due. So if you have a long period of speculation and very high returns that don't seem justified by fundamentals, that's probably about to be reversed. And that was my general feeling about things. But it's interesting, even back in 2000, there were places to hide. In 2000, done well in REITs, emerging markets, small cap value. That was not the case in 2007, 2008. There was almost nowhere except U.S. Treasuries and gold to avoid catastrophe and carnage.
Bill, I have a question. So today, you're obviously managing your own portfolio. Do you have any older clients that you've had for a long time where you're managing their money too, or are you completely out of doing it for other people?
Yeah, I just do for myself and my family. I keep in touch with a lot of those older clients. Unfortunately, their numbers are diminishing, which is very sad to me. But their money is managed by the firm to which I sold the business back in San Diego back in 2013. And they're very happy with it. I was very, very careful who I sold to. Somebody I thought was philosophically very close to myself, had very reasonable fees, and was a NAPFA member. I trusted those folks. And they've done a great job for my clients. And they tell me that years later. So it makes me feel good. But I really think that's the most important decision that a financial advisor has to make when they divest themselves of their practice. Who are they going to hand their clients off to that they can trust so their clients can feel a sense of continuity?
One of the reasons you figured out that it was time to sell your practice and time again out of the market was because you could no longer invest your money like you invested your clients' money. Can you tell us about your glide path out and what you use currently today for a retirement portfolio?
Yeah, well, 2013, bull market continued. Valuations were starting to rise again, and I became really annoyed about all the meddling from government entities in the market. And I didn't think in the long run it was going to end well, although look, here we are 9 years past, 10 years past, 11 years, and the bull market has continued on, so you never know. But I just felt it was becoming increasingly difficult for me to do the kind of job I wanted to and feel comfortable with it. Plus, I was going to be a good grandfather, and I needed more time for that. I spent an awful lot of time in my practice. That was not a 40-hour job, weekends, whatever it took to take care of clients. So it just seemed like the time was right, just like when we sold our family soft drink business back in the late 80s. The time was right.
Well, I think everybody wants to have you as an advisor now because your timing has been impeccable on multiple times, and your timing to get out of the business was impeccable. What do you use today? I mean, you're a conservative guy. How do you manage your portfolio? Are you managing it still for growth because of generational wealth, or how conservative are you because of your fear of market risk?
Well, I'm managing money for myself conservatively, and then I'm managing money for my children and my grandchildren who have much longer time horizons. So they have different asset allocations than I have. I tailor them, just as I did when I was an advisor, based upon their so-called risk tolerance. So it's different for each one. But I don't have anyone fully invested in equities right now. My service is recommending hold about 55% of what you normally would have in equities, and I follow their advice at this time. I think there's a lot of risk in this market, primarily because of valuation, but other factors as well. I agree with them. I don't think this is the time to be fully invested in stocks for anybody except those with very, very long time horizons.
People want to know today, and you seem to have a crystal ball, and you have a little bit more market risk and fear now. What's your prediction? Are we on the verge of a bubble? It seems like everything's got a certain equanimity. Everybody's happy. There's greed, but not an overly robust amount of greed. Do you have a prediction for our audience? And we'll hear it here first.
Well, I like the statement that John Kenneth Galbraith once made about financial forecasting. He said the only purpose of financial forecasting is to make astrology look credible. I was like, that satisfies me. I don't make forecasts because I'm not very good at it, really. It's very difficult. Markets are subject to so many different influences. I can't predict. I don't even try. I follow that third-party advice on allocation changes. But beyond that, I don't try to forecast recessions. I don't try to forecast market crashes, because anybody who seems to try to do that doesn't do very well. So why would I expect to do well on that?
There you go. If you've got the genius Bill Bengen telling you that he cannot predict the future, please don't listen to other people that are claiming that they can predict the future.
Well, avoid the financial pornography, as some folks say, right?
That's right. You ever heard of Mark Twain's definition of a gold mine? He said a gold mine is a hole in the ground with a liar at the top. And I think that's as much for financial forecasting, in my opinion.
You got some good ones.
Bill Bernstein also says, and I think you ascribe to this, is when you won the game, stop playing.
Hey, that's great advice. Unfortunately, Mark Twain went bankrupt in the late 1900s. He was a guy who invested in all kind of high-tech schemes, high-tech for the day. And he was very, very wealthy at one point. He lost almost all of it.
Wow.
He had to go on a lecture tour later in life or work globally to raise money to get his fortune back.
He was the example of a modern day professional athlete that comes into a lot of money and then ends up bankrupt, like we hear about in the media.
He allows people to talk him into schemes that if he had just invested down the middle, we would be hearing about him as a financier, not just a great author.
Yeah, down that simple middle. So, Bill, I'd love to know your thoughts. You spent much of your life in the financial planning industry. In my opinion, definitely a standout that is a credit to the financial planning industry as a whole. Things have changed quite a bit. Back in the day, it was assets under management. Financial planning was very, very closely tied to investments. But today, you have a lot of do-it-yourselfers. A lot of our listeners are do-it-yourselfers. You were as well. But now you've got advice only, where it's hourly. There might be a quarterly fee, flat fees, and things like that. You started out back in the day sort of down that road, but there's been a lot of changes now and even more on the horizon. I would just like to know from your lens, what are your thoughts on the financial planning industry as a whole?
Well, I think it's evolving, and in many respects, in a good way. If people can get advice through hourly fees or low-cost media, and it's good quality advice, I think that's great. The more people that get sound financial advice, the better, because people need it. It's a very complex field. It's easy to make bad decisions, to be ruled by your emotions. You need to have an objective third party with good, sound knowledge of principles to advise you on that. So I hope that it continues to expand and more people can get to use it.
Great. Agreed.
I agree too. I'm going to a financial advisor. Right now I'm a DIYer, but what you need to know, just like the timing issues, is when to stop being that, because it becomes too complex and you don't want to have blind spots. And I've used sort of the age of 60, but when I'm planning on retiring at say 63, as a time to get a comprehensive evaluation of the plan and get to a point of security that at 63, I'm ready to rock and roll.
So, Bill, we want to hear about this book that is coming out. You talked to us a little bit about it at the Bogleheads Conference. We chatted a little bit about it today. So we're so excited because you're so well respected. Clearly, you are one of those people that loves to solve hard problems and is willing to go down the path of doing it. And so a lot of your work is geared towards professionals, the financial planning industry, but this book is more for consumers. So tell us more about it.
Exactly right. My first book I wrote for professionals back in 2006. It was an expensive book, like a textbook kind of a thing. Had a limited sale base, therefore. But over the years, I've gotten an awful lot of communications from non-professionals asking me questions about the 4% rule, how it works, how to implement it. And so I just thought, for my next book, let's write it for everybody. Let's lay it out straight. Let's try to avoid technical jargon. Basically prepare what is in effect a cookbook, how to prepare your own retirement withdrawal plan, and most importantly, how to manage it. I mean, there are a number of books that offer advice on how to calculate your withdrawal rate. I don't see many books that tell you, once you have your plan in place, how do you manage it? How do you monitor it? What do you look for? Every plan is subject to problems. If you're looking at 30, 40, 50-year time frame, it'd be a miracle that you didn't run off plan at some point. You have to know what to look for, and you also have to know what to do about it. So I'm spending a lot of time in this book telling people, using examples, how they should manage their plan once they set up 5% or 6%, whatever it is they use for their withdrawal rate. I think that's equally important to setting up the plan itself. So hopefully people will find something useful there that they can do themselves, or at least if somebody who's doing it for them, understand the process.
So what were the new things you found? You have a different concept of asset allocation now. And what were some of the other new things in your research that are coming out that we can look forward to reading in your book?
Sure. I like the idea of what's called a glide path, which was developed about 10 years ago by two other advisors, Michael Kitces, Wade Fowl. They looked at the idea and they asked the question, what if we don't want to use a fixed asset allocation during retirement? What if we want to vary our stocks in some regular way? And they said, let's particularly look at the situation where we start out with a low percentage of stocks and increase it steadily over time. Intuitively, doesn't seem any reason that should be any more successful than fixed income. Turns out, it is very successful that you can add a significant amount to your withdrawal rate by adopting that glide path, starting at 40%, maybe increasing 1 or 2% a year throughout your retirement. And the reason is that if you encounter a big bear market early in retirement and you're only at 40% stocks instead of 60, you don't get hurt as bad. Meanwhile, after the bear market is over, you're increasing your stock allocation. You're buying into the recovery. And that's why it makes it so successful and why it does add in almost every single case. Every of the 400 retirees I study benefited by using that kind of approach. That's what I call the second free lunch in investing. Diversification being the first one, the glide path approach. And it's not well known, not well understood. I think it's a great strategy, and I gave it quite a bit of time in my book.
Is there going to be a new rule of thumb? Is 5% the new 4%? And then what asset classes are you adding to this to sort of, as you say, supercharge your withdrawal rate?
Yeah, I think you're right. If we're going to use the term rule, 5% is much closer to the truth than 4% now. And that's a reflection of all the additional asset classes that I've put on in the last 18 years. The 7 asset classes I use now are U.S. large cap stocks, U.S. small cap stocks, U.S. micro cap stocks, U.S. mid cap stocks, international stocks. Those are 5 equity classes. Then I use U.S. intermediate term government bonds. That's from the original research, like 5 to 7 year treasuries. In addition, a small amount of cash or treasury bills can be used as a proxy for that. You need to have a cash account to accumulate money for withdrawals anyway. So I built that into the model at a 5% level.
And what percentages do you potentially give to each of these classes?
What I would call a standard allocation, I use 55% in equities, 11% in each of the 5 equity classes, 5% in the money market fund or cash account, and the remaining 40% would go into bonds. Generally, I just use intermediate term treasuries, U.S. government treasuries. Although you could introduce corporate bonds and junk bonds, and a lot of things you could add to that.
Yeah, so many asset classes now. So what is the working title of the book again?
Supercharging the 4% rule, spend more in retirement.
All right. I think that's a great title. It encourages people to spend more. And I think sometimes we have trouble with that. And it will be out sometime in 2025. And I don't know if you have a list of like early reviewers, but if you need early reviewers, we'd love to be on that list. And we'll definitely share it with our audience when that comes out, because we want to know what's on your mind now. And thank you for gearing it toward consumers, do-it-yourselfers, and people that are very interested in this stuff that might not be a professional. I think that'll be very helpful.
Yeah, ever since I started talking about this book, it's amazing how many emails I receive from non-professionals saying, when is this book coming out? What's it about? I want to get it. And it's very gratifying to know that there will be people out there who'll actually look forward to.
Yeah, so you did get my email. Okay, that's great. I'm just kidding. I'm one of those people.
You might get some pushback and criticism from the bogleheads in the simple portfolio now. Once again, you're going against the grain.
Well, I try to call them as I see them. I do the research. I come out with certain conclusions. I spend a lot of time double checking them, and I feel comfortable with what I'm doing. So if what I say is not accepted immediately, I'm used to that. When I first did my first research, I got a lot of nasty mail, including one death threat. Actually, over a 4% rule, you're going to threaten my family? Is it really worth that?
I have not heard that in our research, so maybe you hear it here first. Bill Bengen needed some security.
Yeah.
It's imagine how people get ultra sensitive, but so you have grown some thick skin, and I'm sure we'll be able able to see exactly what you think in this book.
Terrific.
Well, and again, reminding ourselves that we have a late starter audience. In your thoughts, I don't know if you've given much thought to the late starters because of our retirement savings crisis. Do you have any specific advice or tips for those folks out there?
For advice for the late starters in general?
Right.
Yeah, you got to save aggressively, depending upon your goals, depending upon what lifestyle you want to have in retirement. And not everybody needs to live life to the nines. Life, in my opinion, success depends more upon friends and family and doing things you enjoy and not having vast amount of money. But those are personal choices. Carefully about the kind of retirement you want to live and plan your saving accordingly. Make sure those two coordinate. You don't want to oversave. That just means you're starving your current needs for future needs that may never appear. And once you decide upon a saving course, be diligent about it. Stick to it. Do it without exception, because you start missing saving, it's easy for those to multiply. And you start feeling short of your goals and you get frustrated because you're falling behind.
I have a Bill Yount rule of thumb here that I like to ascribe to. I want your thoughts on it too. Because of things like burnout, corporate burnout, healthcare burnout, a lot of burnout out there. I subscribe to the work 20 years for the money and then the rest for joy to get to freedom. And if you start with that, pay off your debt in 5 and then work 15 to get to your nest egg, and then you're free. So that means whenever you start, and ideally you do, say, by 30, because in your 20s, you're trying to figure it out. And the average person that feels like they're late may be in their 30s up until 40. And we do have a large audience in our community that are like that, and they feel like they're late. But the great thing is, if they start at 35, they're done by 55. And that's a good career, and that's a balanced approach. And maybe the accumulation rule should be a savings rate of 25 to 50%. You don't need to save necessarily over 50, because then you end up in deprivation like a lot of the early fire folks. What do you think about the Bill Yount rule of thumb?
I like it. To me, it evokes common sense and achieves a good balance between your long-term goals and what your current needs are.
I'm going to write a book now.
Yeah, you're right. I was about to say, it ain't exactly Bill Bengen quality or Bill Bengen level, but a good try.
Just want to warn you, a book is a lot of work. I mean, I'm supposed to be retired. I've got over 1,000 hours into this book this year, so I don't know how that fits the definition of retired.
Well, I mean, you're living your best life. You're doing what retirees need to do. You can't just retire from something. You need to retire to something. And it keeps you alive a lot longer, right?
Yeah, well, look at these show business figures, George Burns and Bob Hope, that lived to 100. They were doing things they just loved. They didn't care about their age. They were just doing things that they were passionate about. And it was really critical to maintain your passion throughout your whole life. Bob Dylan says in his song, people are either busy being born or busy dying. So you have to make that choice.
So, Bill, I don't know if you ever review this, but you have a Wikipedia page, and that tells us everything we need to know about you. Very interesting. But is there anywhere else people can find you, or should they just look out for the book?
Yeah, I am in the process of designing a website in which I can use then directly to communicate to folks the latest results of my research. My research is very chart heavy. I rely very heavily on charts to guide people to my conclusions. And my book will only contain a fraction of the charts that really are necessary because of all the variables. So I'm going to use that website to provide charts for folks that they can download that are more applicable to their individual situation than, let's say, the generic discussions that I have in my book.
You're kind of a contemporary and a thought leader in some ways like Paul Merriman. Do you know Paul Merriman? And it seems like your thoughts on asset allocation and use and percentages of assets, because he has the 10 funds for life where he gives 10% to each of 10 different asset classes. And you have sort of a 7 funds for life approach. Have you met the man? Have you guys talked about your approaches?
No, I haven't. That's my loss because I admire him, because I read about him and I'm familiar with his work. And I missed a chance at the Bogle conference. I understand he was there to do that. So hopefully I'll catch up with him sometime in the near future.
Well, maybe we'll have to have you back on with Paul Merriman and just have a think tank of information. It would be great. So do you have any final thoughts? Did we cover everything here? Or is there anything on the horizon for Bill Bengen that we haven't heard about yet?
No, except this book will not be my last word on the subject. There's still so many issues I need to look at and so many things I want to share with folks. I expect to be doing this as long as I can live. So stay tuned. Maybe I can get us to 6%. Who knows? But I wouldn't count on that.
We should probably have him on with Frank Vasquez, because I think he'll love your philosophy. He's a big fan of, say, the risk parity approach, which is a little bit different, but yours is a little bit of a risk parity approach too with regards to your allocations. Everybody has a different thought, but I'm just so happy to be able to hear the ideas of all the thought leaders of the industry. And I know our audience feels the same way. Jackie, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, only that as soon as that website is out, that will be amazing. I am one of those visual learners, so I love the charts and graphs. Thank you for doing that. So we will definitely share the book and all the new stuff that you have coming out with our audience. But I, on behalf of everyone else that has benefited from your research, just want to say thank you. Thank you for, at a time in history when nobody was doing this, you said, let me be the one to do the research. Exactly 30 years later, it's still living. It's still the subject of so many conversations, and it's still referenced and cited. So you have made a footprint on the financial world. So just a big thank you for that.
Very kind of you to say that. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It was terrific.
Yeah, I want to know what the name of the website before we go. What do we need to bookmark?
Oh my goodness, I don't have the URL for it. I mean, I'm in such an early stage development, I don't even have the URL for the website. Well, I'll forward that to you as soon as I get it, though.
So you can see how excited we are.
I hope we get to see you maybe at another Bogleheads conference next year, if you can make it. I encourage everybody to try and meet you and meet your wife. And maybe we should have her on next time, because she must have a very interesting perspective on what it's like to be married to the Bill Bengen.
Oh, well, her bad luck, huh? Her misfortune. No, she's terrific. We're actually newlyweds. We only got married 18 months ago. We each lost our spouses 3 years ago, about the same time, met in bereavement group, and that's where our romance started.
How sweet. That's a whole nother podcast. That's beautiful.
You didn't go on Match.com or was it Bumble? I could have seen Bill Bengen on Tinder.
You never know.
But that's a beautiful love story. It was lovely meeting her. And it just goes to show our lives go through so many phases. Obviously, yours has as well. So, yeah, we enjoyed meeting her. And we'd love to have her on the podcast sometimes.
I'll ask her about that. She's terrific. Quite frankly, I can't imagine my life without her. We both understand the value of having lost spouses, which we consider the worst thing that could possibly happen to a person. We both appreciate now the value of having a companion, which we feel so closely to, and treasure our relationship beyond all other things.
I feel the same way. And that's a key component to retirement in my mind, and longevity, is a partner to see the world with. So
I agree.
It has been an honor to talk to you. This is one of the highlights of my year. We have been honored to talk to so many leaders in this field. I encourage people to go back in our episodes and just enjoy all of the great minds that we're able to have on here. And just want to again say thank you. Thank you to Jackie. Thank you to Bill. And we will see you next time on Catching Up to FI. Happy anniversary to your article.
Thanks so much. Enjoyed it, folks. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
So, Bill, as you know, we cannot do this show without our amazing staff and the people that help us put this on. Our social media maven is Diana Falk, and our editor is Fritz Brazard. We love them, and they keep us going.
Yeah, Jackie, I mean, this show wouldn't have the quality it has without our folks, our peeps. And we'd also like to give you a few calls to action for the show. We love our community, and we hope you love us back. If you would like to support the show and our mission to help late starters, you can do that at Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform that allows you to make a donation. The link is in the show notes and on the website.
Check out the show notes for resources mentioned in today's show. Also, head on over to our website at catchinguptofi.com and check out our vetted resources, partners, and affiliates for discounts and their services, because we love sharing great deals.
Please share the show with others and head on over to our Facebook community to help us grow. If you prefer video, head on over to YouTube and watch the show there. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to FI. We would appreciate it if you could also leave us a 5-star review to help our message reach others.
And while we are financial educators that love to teach, remember that our content is for general education and information purposes only. We are not providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Always do your own research or consult a professional before making important decisions.
So, Jackie, we'll see our audience next time on CUtFI. Cheers.